Hello, government students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 7, Section 1, How a Bill Becomes a Law. So, we are going to talk a little bit about this process, and you should have a handout that kind of looks a little bit like this. One of the things that I want to point out is whatever happens in one house of Congress has to happen in the other. It's kind of like a mirror effect by all means. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to mention the things that happen in the House, and then eventually we're going to talk about the Senate. And what you're going to find is it's almost identical here. So this should go fairly quickly, but it's the complicated stuff in the middle that we kind of have to focus on a little bit. So if you're going to introduce a bill in the House of Representatives, we talked a while back about putting a bill in the hopper. And that's one of the things that's a little different compared to the Senate. Members of the House of Representatives, since there's far more of them, use this method because it's really much more efficient. If everybody had to wait to be called upon, it could take forever to get anything done. And so by putting the bill in the hopper, that speeds up this whole process of the introduction. Okay. Though, uh, granted, when we look at the Senate, it's going to be done just slightly differently, but it's still all in an introduction. Okay. So once the bill has been introduced or put in the hopper, then the bill is going to be eventually sent to committee. It's going to be within that committee where the bill is going to be studied. It's going to possibly have a hearing on it. It's going to be voted upon. It is possible that once this bill gets in the committee, if there are members on the committee that don't like it, it could be pigeonholed. In other words, it could be put off to the side with the whole purpose of never allowing it to come to a vote. Okay. In other words, really at any step of this process, doesn't matter if we're talking about the House or the Senate or whatever happens when we talk about the finalization of a bill could die. Okay. And in most cases, there are probably far more bills that die than actually make it to the president's desk to be signed into law. Okay. But if that bill that's in committee survives, it will be voted upon. And once it is voted upon, it's going to leave committee. And eventually, that bill is going to be sent to the floor of the House of Representatives and it will be debated upon. Okay. And just so you know, in the House, because of the fact that it's kind of complicated to get things done here, there are certain rules about debates. It may be such a thing that um, representatives only have a certain number of minutes that they can talk on a bill or debate a bill. So it is possible that maybe you might have 10 minutes to say everything that you want to say about your position on this. And then eventually it's going to be voted upon. And if it doesn't pass, then it dies at that point in time. If it does pass, then the bill is going to have to eventually go through the Senate. Okay, and vice versa. If a bill starts in the Senate, once it gets to the floor and it's voted upon and it passes, it's going to have to go through the House. So let's talk a little bit about the Senate. There is an introduction, but unlike in the House where it's a bill's put in the hopper, senators are going to be recognized by whoever is holding the chair that day. And if you remember back, the person who is kind of the presiding officer of the Senate is actually the vice president. But on a day-to-day basis, the vice president normally isn't on Capitol Hill. The Senate pro tempore might be there, and it is possible that the gavel to run, the Senate may travel around and other senators may have the opportunity to go ahead and introduce legislation. But if you're a senator, you have to be recognized by the chair. And that usually means that you have to get onto your feet and introduce this legislation verbally to the members of the Senate. Okay, once it's introduced, then it's going to be sent off to committee just like in the House. And the same thing's going to happen. It's going to be studied. There might be hearings. There's a possibility that things will be voted upon. It is possible that members of that committee don't like the legislation and they might purposely ignore it or pigeonhole it. But at some point in time, it's going to have to come out, and thus it's going to have to be voted upon. And it is possible that in that vote it may die, and it is possible in that vote it's going to be passed. And if it is passed, then it will go to the floor of the Senate, and the senators will get an opportunity to debate it and to vote. Now, debating in the Senate's a little different than in the House. Certainly, there aren't as many rules, but it is possible that you might have a senator that has kind of an agenda of their own, and they might get on the floor and they might just start talking the bill to death. In other words, using a filibuster. But filibusters are pretty rare. It's not necessarily something that's going to be used every day. But if it is voted upon and it is supported, if the bill has not gone through the House, it will have to be sent there. But let's say the bill originated in the House and it's gone through the Senate, then it will probably come back to what we call, if I can remove this, a conference committee. Okay, conference committee isn't always used, but it is used in circumstances where members of the House and the Senate actually pass bills that have different wording, meaning that there might have been certain provisions that members of the House put into the bill that members of the Senate didn't. And what's going to happen in this conference committee is another series of debates. Those people who are sent to the committee will argue and try to figure out the wording that's going to be appealing to both members of the House and the Senate. And once they've determined that, then it's going to go back to the floors of both the House and the Senate for final passage. If it passes, then it eventually will go to the president. But it is possible that members of Congress don't like the wording, and they could actually kill this legislation after all this work. Okay, that's kind of a bummer, but it does happen. All right. But if it does pass, then it will go to the president. The president can do a few different things. They could either sign this piece of legislation into law, or they can veto it. And there's different ways they can veto. There's something called a pocket veto, which basically means that this bill ends up on the president's desk and the president kind of ignores it. And within a period of roughly 10 days or 2 weeks, the bill will die just because no action was taken on it. There are certain vetoes that our president doesn't have access to. There was a time where you heard about this thing called a line item veto, where typically a governor, not a president, would be able to take a red pen and to go through a piece of legislation, and if there was something in that legislation that they didn't like, they could cross the wording out. But more often is the case, a president is either going to sign it or officially veto it. All right, let's keep going on here. We're going to talk a little bit about bills and resolutions, and eventually we'll kind of wrap this up here. But a private bill is usually a piece of legislation that deals with individual people or places. So if I were introducing a bill that wants to honor a certain person for their, maybe a military service person, for their heroic deeds in combat or such, I can introduce a private bill that is going to honor that person. Or I might be able to honor a certain place, kind of the same way. More often is what we're going to find is public bills or public legislation. And this is basically a bill or a piece of legislation that applies to the entire nation. And it's usually over issues that are kind of controversial. So in this day and age, it would have a lot to do with like raising taxes or issues like gun control, which is pretty controversial in our country, or the national healthcare insurance program like Obamacare. All those kind of things certainly get people kind of one-sided on certain issues. All right. And number 3, you can have a resolution. kind of like a bill, but not quite. The thing about a resolution is it only deals with internal matters that deal with only one house of Congress. So if it is about maybe the rules that they're going to use to study a certain bill, they might be able to pass this resolution that says they can only debate on it or only study this for a certain period of time. All right. And number four, when both houses agree, they can pass what is known as a joint resolution. For example, to correct some kind of error in an earlier law. So if a law has been passed and signed by the president, but there is some wording in that law that is maybe a little vague or unclear, the joint resolution can go back and it can correct that error. Another thing it can do is to appropriate money for a special purpose. And occasionally there's going to be times when the government needs to raise money or to put money into a certain program. For example, with the COVID-19 situation that we're dealing with, there is a need to put money out very quickly to help first responders and doctors and hospitals and health agencies deal with this. And so they can pass this resolution and bypass having to go through the whole process of introducing and debating and committee work and such. Number five, you can have a concurrent resolution, which on the other hand does not have the force of a law, but it does not require a president's signature. And yet to take effect, both houses of Congress have to pass it. Moving on. Number six, fewer than 10% of bills introduced in Congress ever become public law. And there's a few reasons for that. One, lawmaking is really complicated. There's a lot of ways that you can kill a bill before it gets very far. There are a lot of ways that you can delay a bill. And there are a lot of ways that a bill can be changed. And hence it makes it really difficult. There are a lot of compromises that have to take place that are necessary. You got to, if you're dealing with two political parties, you got to meet the needs of those different parties. And then finally, the whole process can be really time consuming. The studying of it, just trying to get something in and out of both houses of Congress, it can really be mind boggling as far as how slow things can take place. But that's also maybe to our benefit because of the fact that it's hard to get things through Congress. We're not inundated with a ton of laws. We kind of have to fight for the ones that are really important. So in number seven, ideas for new laws. So who proposes this? It can come from a lot of different places. It can be from us, the private citizens. If there's something out there that I think I can help Congress with, I can write my lawmakers and propose something. It could be an issue near and dear to someone's heart. Interest groups that work for certain areas of business or groups like teachers, they can propose legislation. And then our president has some opinions, and our president certainly can propose legislation. Or other members of the executive branch. This would come from for example, like the Department of Justice or the Defense Department or the Department of Agriculture or such. All right. To introduce a bill in the House, we've mentioned this before, the bill has to be put in the hopper. And then in the Senate, you've got to be recognized by the presiding officer who would be holding the gavel on a given day. All right. So how does House and Senate differ in introducing a bill? We just mentioned this. House puts it in the hopper, and in the Senate, you've got to be recognized formally to present it. All right. Thank you very much.